put it in words you might understand, Mr. Trump, off.
If you take a look outside of Greenland right now, there are Russian destroyers, there are Chinese destroyers and bigger, there are Russian submarines all over the place.
The world responding to President Trump's escalating pressure campaign to take control of Greenland.
Greenland! Hands up! Greenland!
These images you see are not from Moscow or Tehran. This chaos comes from NATO's most strategic ally, the Kingdom of Denmark, right at the heart of the alliance. Washington calculated that it could reapply the 19th century Alaska model, put money on the table, and take over a strategic geography without resistance. However, the images flooding in from the streets of Copenhagen and Nuuk on the morning of January 17, 2026, prove that the White House's calculations have not just failed, they have backfired spectacularly. The people of Greenland have struggled with the harshest conditions of nature for centuries, but now, as reflected in these images captured on camera, they are fighting the greatest political battle for survival in their history.
We were raised and born, people lived in Greenland.
This wave of protests, which began on January 17th and is still ongoing, has turned into a single unified slogan along the 4,000-kilometer stretch from Nuuk to Copenhagen. Kalalit Nunat, that is, land of the people.
Trying to bully his way to undermine the sovereignty of the Greenlandic people.
According to information verified by field sources, more than 20,000 protesters gathered in the streets of Copenhagen and marched directly to the United States Embassy with Greenland flags in their hands. Simultaneously in Nuuk, at minus 20 degrees Celsius, Greenland Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen and the Speaker of Parliament personally initiated a vigil of honor in front of the United States consulate. The reaction we see here is not against the American people, but a stance of sovereignty against the tone of the current administration in Washington. The most critical detail here is the language of the crowd. Protesters are responding to Trump not in English, but in their local language, Kalayalisut. This is a strategic message to Washington. You cannot understand us because you cannot buy us. Footage from the streets of Nuuk shows slogans chanted by the local people, proving that this is not a bargaining table, but a battle for dignity. Another detail that stands out in the footage is the ironic hats. Make America go away.
Land is our country and it belongs to us.
This slogan is the most concrete proof that fear of a superpower has given way to confident national anger. However, this slogan is not an expression of hatred, but a humorous expression of the local people's desire to have a say in their own land. This is the clearest response to Trump's strategy. We are one, and we are definitely not for sale. Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen's words actually sum it all up and mark the end of diplomatic courtesy. In a historic statement, he declared, "We choose Denmark, we choose NATO, we choose the Kingdom of Denmark, we choose the European Union."
Vi vælger kongeriget Danmark, vi vælger EU. Tiden er ikke inde til interne.
Greenland has determined its own future within the Kingdom of Denmark, and that future is not for sale. This was a declaration of a nation's collective will. However, the White House's response to this dignified stance explains why the crisis deepened. Hours later, Trump responded to the Prime Minister's words with a dismissal that shocked European capitals. Well, that is their problem. I disagree with him. I do not know who he is, don't know anything about him, but that is going to be a big problem for him. This statement is more than a leader's political stance. It is a threat to the collective will of a nation, and it has set the stage for a confrontation that goes far, far beyond diplomacy. The people of Greenland do not want their land to be riddled with holes by American mining companies, turning Greenland into a black mining area. Environmental sensitivity is not just a preference for these people, it is a way of life. The administration's mentality of drill, baby, drill is a nightmare scenario for these people living among the glaciers. The Greenlanders' loyalty to Denmark is not just an emotional bond, but also a rational choice. Surveys and field analyses show that 85% of the population rejects becoming United States citizens. Why? Because they do not want to sacrifice Denmark's free education, universal health care, and strong social security network to the uncertainty and savage capitalism of the American system. This refusal is not hostility toward America, but a reflex to protect the Scandinavian social model. They see the healthcare crisis, income inequality, and social decay in the United States, and say, we will not integrate our children into this system. This defiance in the North Atlantic is not just an isolated incident. It is a signal flare that has illuminated deep fractures within the Western alliance itself. For decades, the relationship between Washington and Copenhagen was built on mutual respect and shared security interests, primarily centered around the Thule Air Base. But that dynamic has shifted overnight from partnership to coercion. When the protesters in Copenhagen hold up signs saying Greenland is not for sale, they are not just talking about land, they are talking about their identity. The red and white flags of Denmark and Greenland waving side by side in the freezing wind symbolize a unity that the White House completely underestimated. They expected the Danes to be pragmatic businessmen. Instead, they found a people who place principle above profit. This miscalculation is arguably the greatest diplomatic failure in the Arctic region since the Cold War ended. Furthermore, the optics of thousands of citizens from a NATO ally marching against the leader of the alliance are devastating for the United States' soft power. These images are being broadcast not just in Europe, but in Beijing and Moscow, where they are viewed as evidence of the West's internal collapse. The protesters are not just angry, they are organized, disciplined, and supported by their government. This is not a fringe movement. It is the mainstream consensus of the Danish kingdom. When a superpower loses the ability to persuade its closest friends and resorts to public threats, it loses something far more valuable than a piece of territory. It loses its moral authority. And in the eyes of the 20,000 people on the streets of Copenhagen, that authority has already evaporated. Ironically, this anger is not confined to the streets of Nuuk or Copenhagen. It echoes in the corridors of Washington itself, at the very heart of the American empire. The American people absolutely reject the idea of their tax dollars, their trillions of dollars, being spent on an Arctic adventure with an uncertain outcome. Recent polls conducted by Reuters and Ipsos are nothing short of a shock for the White House. Only 17% of Americans support this acquisition. The vast majority of the remaining population sees it as an unnecessary, dangerous. This is a very rare situation in United States history. The legislative branch is using the power of the purse to tie the hands of the executive branch to prevent the commander-in-chief from mobilizing the army. It is a desperate attempt to stop a machine that has already started moving. However, the White House is not backing down. According to the latest information, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio gathered at the White House to hold a final ultimatum meeting with their Danish counterparts. The only item on the agenda was the handover. The administration is operating on the belief that pressure will eventually crack the Danish resolve, failing to realize that this pressure is precisely what is welding the Danish political spectrum together into an unbreakable bloc. In the halls of Congress, names like Senator Lisa Murkowski and Hans Shaheen are preparing a funding ban bill to tie Trump's hands. This bill is the moment when the brake mechanism of American democracy kicks in. Even 50% of Republicans think this plan is madness and will blow up NATO from within. Trump is becoming increasingly isolated in the White House, falling into the position of an emperor questioned even by his own party. This political isolation shows that the crisis is creating a deep fracture. House bills and Senate bills are competing with each other. One freezes funds for acquisition and operation, while the other aims to block military shipments. This situation shows that the American state apparatus is locked within itself, that the decision-making mechanisms are at an impasse. It is a spectacle of governance failure where the world's strongest military power is paralyzed by its own internal contradictions, unable to agree on who the enemy actually is. Trump constantly brings up the 1867 purchase of Alaska, citing that vast piece of land purchased from Russia for $7.2 million. He says, "We did it then, we can do it again, it is just a real estate deal." But there is a huge reality he ignores. This is not the 19th century, and Greenlanders are not fixed assets to be bought and sold. Alaska was ridiculed at the time as Seward's folly, but it was a strategic move that redefined the American map. However, today, the Greenland initiative is perceived less as a strategic masterpiece and more as a reckless gamble that disregards the fundamental laws of alliance. The fact that public support is so low shows that the American people also recognize this sharp historical distinction. They understand that sovereignty in the 21st century is not a commodity that can be traded over a handshake in a backroom. The world has moved on from the era of colonial purchases, even if the White House has not. History actually teaches us another lesson that the current administration seems to have forgotten. In 1946, President Harry Truman also tried to buy Greenland, offering $100 million in gold. Denmark politely declined, and Truman withdrew amicably, respecting the decision of a sovereign partner. The alliance was not broken, and relations were not damaged because respect was the currency of the day. The difference with Trump is his insistence on a binary outcome, either nicely or by force. The global public currently views Greenland as akin to Hong Kong under Chinese pressure, or Crimea under Russian occupation, victimized yet proud, isolated yet resilient. This is no longer a real estate negotiation. It is a test of whether the rule of law still exists in the Western world. If the United States can simply take what it wants from an ally, then the entire concept of a rules-based international order becomes nothing more than a convenient fiction. Right now, one of the most surreal, dangerous, and unbelievable scenes in NATO history is unfolding on the Arctic ice, a scene that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. The German armed forces, Bundeswehr and Sohr-Union, British troops are landing in Greenland, officially under the guise of a scheduled exercise, but actually on a shield mission to deter any impulsive moves from Washington. The Danish Ministry of Defense has officially confirmed that the United States has deployed vanguard units to the island in response to threats, creating a standoff between allies who fought side by side for decades. The specific detail that planes belonging to the Polish airline Enter Air are transporting German soldiers marks that historic moment when Europe's common defense reflex ironically turned against the United States. This is the physical manifestation of a fractured alliance, where the barrels of guns are slowly turning away from external enemies and toward internal disputes. The presence of German and British boots on the ground changes the calculus completely. It is one thing to bully a small nation like Denmark. It is entirely another to risk a direct confrontation with the major powers of Europe. These troops are not there to fight a war. They are there as a tripwire, a geopolitical signal that an attack on Greenland is an attack on Europe. The irony is palpable. NATO was built to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, German troops are flying north to keep the Americans out. This inversion of the post-war order suggests that the structures we relied on for stability are dissolving before our eyes. The atmosphere at the airfields in Greenland is tense, with NATO standard-issue equipment being unloaded by soldiers who are confused about their mission. They trained to fight together. Now they stand on opposite sides of an invisible line drawn by political ambition. Now militarily stopped and held back by a defiant Congress, Trump is playing his most destructive card, the economic nuclear button known as customs duties. The threat of a 25% additional tariff on Denmark and other NATO allies supporting this resistance has the potential to paralyze an already fragile global trade system. This is not just a tax, it is economic blackmail designed to suffocate the Danish economy until it surrenders its sovereignty. The administration believes that while soldiers can be stopped by laws, money flows where it wants, and they are betting that Copenhagen will buckle under the weight of financial ruin. These words from Paris and Brussels are the official declaration that the Atlantic Alliance is now hanging by a thread, turning the barrel of Trump's economic weapon back on himself. Historically, it is a known fact that tariffs trigger recessions, and a trade war of this magnitude could drag the entire Western world into a financial abyss. Now the world is holding its breath, watching to see whether the fuse of a global economic crisis will be lit over a piece of icy land. So why all this fighting? Just for profit, ice, and national pride? Absolutely not. Greenland has the largest alternative reserve of rare earth elements in the Western Hemisphere, which are the building blocks of modern technology, and are used in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. China currently dominates this market, and Washington fears that without Greenland, it will lose the technological war of the 21st century. Trump is trying to create a fear empire by saying, if we do not take it, China will. However, this argument does not match the reality on the ground for the Greenlandic people. They are keenly aware that their land holds the periodic table of the future, but they refuse to let that geological luck become a curse. The administration sees these minerals as strategic assets. The locals see them as part of their home, not to be ripped out by foreign excavators without consent. The struggle goes beyond just minerals. It is about the control of the planet's new nervous system. The transpolar route opened up by melting glaciers is a new geopolitical corridor that will bypass the Suez Canal and shorten the trade route between Asia and Europe by thousands of kilometers. Trump aims to acquire Greenland to both sever China's polar Silk Road and block Russia's northern exit, killing two birds with one stone, control strategic routes while securing rare metals, the oil of the future. While analysts see this as a strategic move, for the local population, it means the uncontrolled transfer of their resources and an existential economic threat. They understand that whoever controls Greenland controls the gateway to the Arctic, and they are unwilling to hand that key over to a power that dismisses their existence. The melting ice is revealing not just shipping lanes, but the raw ambition of superpowers who see the Arctic not as an ecosystem, but as a chessboard. However, the Greenlandic people do not want their land to be riddled with holes, turning their pristine environment into a black mining pit. Environmental sensitivity prevails over strategic ambitions in Nuuk. For them, these lands are not a mining site, but their ancestors' legacy and their children's future. The Chinese threat, or the Russian threat, does not legitimize American exploitation in their eyes, and they refuse to be pawns in a great power game. The environmental consciousness of the Greenlanders, acting like a wrench thrown into the gears of global capitalism, brings the entire system to a halt. They are saying that some things, like clean water, untouched glaciers, and indigenous rights, are simply not for sale, no matter how many zeros are on the check. This clash of values is absolute. On one side, the insatiable hunger of industrial strategy. On the other, the immovable object of cultural survival.